We'd been to a lot of missing person calls before, but something about this one felt different. Her phone was off, her car wasn't there, and the front door was unlocked. Inside, everything looked normal. But near the garage, there was blood. Not much, just enough to know someone tried to clean it. That's when I realized we weren't looking for a missing person anymore.
In 1992, police entered a house that looked perfectly ordinary, a small two-story home tucked into a quiet suburban street outside Minneapolis. The dishes were still on the counter, the TV remote lay neatly beside a folded blanket, and a single lamp glowed in the corner of the living room. But the woman who lived there, Diana Duve, was gone. No broken glass, no overturned furniture, not even a sign that anyone had forced their way inside. It was as if she'd simply stepped out of her own life and vanished. At first, no one panicked. Friends thought she might have gone for a walk, maybe stayed with her sister. But when the hours stretched into a full day and her car remained parked in the driveway, unease began to spread. Diana was reliable, the kind of woman who returned calls, who showed up early, who left little notes for herself on the fridge. Disappearing without a trace wasn't her style. By the next morning, neighbors noticed her mail piling up. The porch light still burned from the night before. And that's when police were called. Inside, officers found a life frozen mid-motion. Her purse was on the kitchen counter. Her keys hung neatly on the hook by the door. Even her shoes were in their usual place, lined up by size. But the strangest detail wasn't what they found. It was what they didn't. Diana's phone book, the one she used every day, was missing. And the last person she'd spoken to, according to a half-scribbled note by the phone, was a man named Mark R. Investigators quickly learned that Diana Duve, 34, had recently finalized her divorce. Friends said she'd been rebuilding. New job, new friends, a sense of freedom she hadn't felt in years. She'd even mentioned meeting someone new, someone who made her feel seen again. But she kept the details vague, almost secretive. When pressed, she'd just smile and change the subject. Her co-workers at the local insurance office described her as bright, organized, and gentle. On her last day at work before the disappearance, she left early, telling a colleague she had something important that evening. No one knew what that meant. The following day, she never arrived at the office. Calls went unanswered. And by day 3, her family's calm had turned into fear. Police began canvassing the area, knocking on doors, asking if anyone had seen anything unusual that night. One neighbor recalled seeing a dark sedan parked outside Diana's house around 8 p.m., engine running, headlights off. When asked if he saw who was inside, the neighbor hesitated. "I thought it was just a date," he said. Diana had been smiling a lot lately. Detectives traced Diana's bank cards and found no recent activity. Her last purchase, a bottle of red wine and a take-out dinner from a nearby deli. The receipt was time-stamped 7:16 p.m. That same bottle, half empty, sat on her kitchen counter when police arrived. There were no signs of forced entry, no fingerprints that didn't belong. Yet one thing caught investigators' attention. The phone cord in the kitchen had been stretched tight, as if someone had pulled it sharply before hanging up. By day 4, the search widened. Parks, lakes, wooded areas, all combed for any clue. Volunteers posted flyers with Diana's photo, shoulder-length brown hair, soft eyes, and that calm half-smile everyone remembered. Still, no trace. As days turned into weeks, the story spread across Minnesota. Headlines read, "Local woman vanishes without a trace." Reporters called it the most puzzling case of the year. Then, a breakthrough, but not the kind anyone wanted. On a cold February morning, a jogger spotted something along a narrow trail by the Mississippi River. At first, he thought it was discarded clothing tangled in the brush, but as he moved closer, he froze. It was a woman's coat, and beneath it, something far worse. The body was badly decomposed, partially hidden under fallen branches. It was wrapped loosely in a blanket that looked eerily familiar. Floral print, the same pattern as the one missing from Diana's couch. Dental records confirmed what everyone feared. It was Diana Duve. The autopsy revealed bruising on her wrists and faint marks around her neck. But cause of death, inconclusive. There was no clear evidence of strangulation, no blunt trauma, no bullet wounds. Toxicology showed traces of alcohol, but nothing lethal. It seemed impossible. How could a healthy woman die without a cause and end up by the river miles from home? Investigators now faced two mysteries: how Diana died and who wanted her gone. Attention quickly turned to her ex-husband, Richard Duve. Friends said their split had been tense. He'd resented her independence and was known to show up uninvited even after the divorce. But Richard denied everything. He claimed he hadn't seen her in weeks and had spent that evening at his brother's house, an alibi that at first glance checked out. Then came another name, Mark R., the man Diana had supposedly been seeing. Police discovered he was Mark Rivens, a co-worker who'd recently joined the same office, married, 2 kids. And according to one colleague, he and Diana had been spending a lot of late nights together working on reports. When questioned, Mark admitted the affair, but insisted he had nothing to do with her death. "We argued that night," he said, "but she was alive when I left." But the timing was off. Phone records showed Diana's landline went dead at 8:37 p.m., the exact minute Mark claimed he was still in her driveway. Still, without clear evidence, police couldn't charge him. The case grew cold, resting in a box of unsolved files marked only with her name, Diana Duve. Years would pass before anyone looked inside that box again, until one detective, decades later, noticed a single overlooked detail that changed everything. Nearly 10 years had passed since Diana Duve's disappearance and death. The case had faded from the headlines, reduced to a stack of yellowing reports and untested evidence sealed away in a police archive. Her family had moved on in fragments. Birthdays, holidays, and quiet dinners where her name was still spoken, but only softly, as if saying it too loudly might reopen old wounds. For years nothing changed, no new suspects, no fresh leads, just silence. Then, in the spring of 2002, a new cold case unit was formed in the Minneapolis Police Department, a small team tasked with revisiting unsolved crimes that had slipped through the cracks of time. Among the boxes delivered to their office was one labeled Duve, Diana, 1992. Inside, photographs, handwritten notes, phone logs, and a single plastic evidence bag containing a piece of fabric from the blanket found near her body. Detective Laura Kane was the one who opened it. She wasn't looking for miracles, just patterns. But something about this case stood out. The original reports described no defensive wounds, no clear struggle, and a missing phone book. Laura noticed an odd note written by one of the first responders. Phone cord unusually stretched. A detail small enough to be forgotten, but significant enough to hint at something darker. She ordered the old evidence to be re-examined using modern forensic methods. The lab technicians began their slow, meticulous work, swabbing, scanning, analyzing fibers with tools that hadn't existed a decade earlier. Then came the first real surprise. On the fabric of the blanket and visible to the naked eye, they found a faint DNA profile. It wasn't Diana's, and it didn't belong to her ex-husband, Richard Duve. It was male, partial, degraded, but distinct enough to enter into CODIS, the National DNA Database. The system lit up, not with a full match, but a partial familial hit. someone related to the unidentified contributor had a criminal record. And that person was none other than Mark Rivens' younger brother, Daniel. It wasn't proof, but it was enough to reopen the file. Detectives retraced every step of Diana's final evening. Her last confirmed sighting was still the same: the deli, the wine, and that short phone call around 8 p.m. The new team also revisited her home photos and noticed something chilling: a faint handprint on the inside of the glass patio door. It had never been processed for prints because in 1992 the technology wasn't sensitive enough. This time it was. The results showed a partial fingerprint, one that matched Mark Rivens. Confronted with the new findings, Mark claimed the print made sense. He'd been to her home many times, he said. But the more detectives pressed, the shakier his story became. He had always maintained that he left Diana's house alive at around 8:30 p.m. Yet phone records placed her last outgoing call at 8:37, the same minute her line suddenly went dead. For years, that detail had been treated as coincidence. Now it looked like the moment she died. Investigators began rebuilding the timeline minute by minute. The deli receipt showed she'd planned a quiet evening, dinner for two. No sign she expected trouble. But after Rivens' car was identified by a witness that night, something clicked. The neighbor who'd seen a dark sedan outside her home had described it as a late model Ford, dark blue, maybe black. Police records confirmed Rivens drove one, registered in his wife's name. They brought him back for questioning. He didn't know that the DNA link to his brother had surfaced. He didn't know about the new fingerprint analysis either. When asked why his phone records showed a call to Diana just after 7 p.m. and another at 8:31, he hesitated. He claimed he'd been calling to make up after an argument. But the detectives weren't convinced. Something in his timeline didn't fit. And as they kept digging, another twist emerged. A friend of Diana's named Martha had kept a small diary. It had been turned over to police years earlier, but dismissed as personal notes. Now, in hindsight, one entry from the day before Diana vanished felt like a warning. He said he'd leave his wife soon, but I don't believe him. He's been getting angry lately, said if I tell anyone he'll ruin me. The handwriting was unmistakably Diana's. It was the kind of note that in 1992 might have sounded like relationship drama. In 2002, it sounded like motive. With the evidence mounting, investigators searched Mark Rivens' old property. In the garage attic, behind a loose panel, they found a cardboard box filled with letters, photos, and, shockingly, a small address book with the name Diana written on the first page. The pages inside were torn out, leaving only one surviving note with a phone number scribbled next to the initials MR, the missing phone book from Diana's kitchen. Forensic tests later confirmed the torn paper fibers matched the ones left behind in her home phone area. The implication was clear. Someone had taken her book that night, likely to remove their name. Rivens' brother Daniel was questioned next. His DNA was the partial match on the blanket, but he denied ever meeting Diana. He insisted he'd been living in another state at the time, a claim that, frustratingly, couldn't be disproven. There was no direct evidence tying him to the crime scene, just a whisper of genetic overlap. Still, with modern science and a mountain of circumstantial proof, prosecutors believed they finally had enough. In 2003, more than a decade after Diana's death, Mark Rivens was arrested and charged with second-degree murder. The media swarmed the story, branding it justice delayed. To the public, it seemed like closure, a cold case finally solved. But behind the scenes, detectives were uneasy. Something about the evidence didn't sit right. Why would Rivens' DNA not appear anywhere near the body? Why would a blanket from her own home carry a partial trace of his brother instead? And most importantly, if Diana's death had been a crime of passion, where was the moment of violence? There were no defensive wounds, no signs of a struggle, no definitive cause of death. The deeper investigators dug, the more one disturbing possibility emerged. What if Diana Duve's death wasn't the result of anger, but of careful planning? And what if the person they'd arrested wasn't working alone? The trial of Mark Rivens began in the fall of 2003, 11 years after Diana Duve was found by the river. The courtroom was packed. Reporters, family members, and strangers who'd followed the story since the beginning. To many, Mark was already guilty, but for investigators still haunted by unanswered questions, the truth was far less certain. The prosecution leaned heavily on motive, a secret affair, a married man afraid his double life would collapse. They painted Mark as a man cornered by his own lies, pushed to silence the one person who could expose him. They presented the fingerprint, the missing phone book, the diary entry, and the blanket DNA as their pillars of proof. The defense fought back with science. The DNA on the blanket, they argued, didn't belong to Mark. The fingerprint was partial, easily transferred from previous visits. And the cause of death? Still undetermined. Without a confirmed homicide, how could there be a murderer? The jury deliberated for days. When they returned, the verdict shocked nearly everyone. Not guilty. Mark Rivens walked free. For Diana's family, it was another loss layered over the first. The man they believed had taken her life was gone, untouchable. But for the cold case unit, it wasn't over. Because buried deep in the lab reports, something had quietly changed. A new match appeared in the National DNA database months after the trial ended. It wasn't Mark. It wasn't his brother, Daniel. It was a man named Thomas Klein, a name no one had ever connected to the case before. Klein was a contractor who, in 1992, had done renovation work in the very neighborhood where Diana lived. Back then, his DNA wouldn't have been in any database, but in 2004, after a minor assault conviction, it finally was. The match was partial, but stronger than before, enough to reopen a new line of inquiry. When detectives began digging into Klein's history, they discovered something disturbing. He had lived just 3 blocks from Diana's house at the time of her disappearance. More than that, phone company records showed that his number appeared in Diana's old landline log multiple times during the weeks before she vanished. Klein was questioned, and his story was evasive. He claimed he didn't know her personally, that maybe she'd called him for repair work. But there were no service records, no receipts, and when police searched his old storage locker, they found something they never expected: a box of old photographs, all of women he had dated, followed, or in some cases, simply observed. Tucked at the bottom was a faded photo of Diana Duve. Now the story took a darker turn. What if Diana's death wasn't about love or betrayal, but about obsession? A stranger she barely knew who'd been watching her long before she ever met Mark Rivens. Re-examining the physical evidence through that lens changed everything. The stretched phone cord, perhaps not from a struggle, but from someone cutting the line. The missing phone book, stolen not to hide a lover's name, but to erase a number belonging to someone far more dangerous. And that blanket, wrapped around her body, carried DNA from a man who lived nearby, a man who might have been inside her home long before anyone realized. The puzzle that once seemed simple, a woman, a lover, a jealous rage, was now something far more sinister. Investigators tried to build a case, but it was too late. Thomas Klein had died 2 years earlier in a car accident. There would be no confession, no trial, and no justice that could be carried out in a courtroom. Still, one question lingered. If Klein had killed Diana, how did her body end up by the river, miles from her home, wrapped in her own blanket? Police went back to the original reports, tracing the chain of evidence. That's when they discovered something unsettling. The first responding officer, the one who'd noted the stretched phone cord, had also written that the back door was unlocked when they arrived. That detail had been dismissed for years. But when compared to the geographic data from Klein's known haunts, it fit perfectly. He lived less than a mile from the river trail. It was the perfect location. Secluded, dark, and quiet. He wouldn't have needed a car to move her there. He could have walked the path himself, carrying what was left of his obsession wrapped in a blanket that once belonged in her home. In the end, the case of Diana Duve became one of the most haunting cold cases in Minnesota's history. Not because of its brutality, but because of its silence. There was no dramatic fight, no clear moment of violence, no traceable confession. Just a woman who vanished into the night, a town that searched for answers, and a system that pointed in all the wrong directions for over a decade. For investigators, the lesson was grim but clear. Sometimes the truth doesn't hide in what's missing. It hides in what we stopped looking at. And for the people who loved Diana Duve, closure never came in the form of a verdict or a name. It came only in the quiet understanding that evil doesn't always come with warning signs, and that sometimes the most ordinary moments can be the ones that end everything.